Shalom, some preliminary thoughts about Yom Kippur this year and some items that might be of interest in thinking about Yom Kippur. Well, first of all, when we experience Yom Kippur, we experience it as a mini death. As we all know, we don't eat like we're dead. We wear, in Orthodox shuls, most of the people, or a lot of them, and in our synagogues, at least the clergy, wear white kittos like a tachrich in the burial shroud. We're not supposed to have sexual relations, to wash up, like a mini death. Now, why do we do that? Well, the sages clearly wanted us to experience, as the Torah says, to afflict ourselves, to do kapara, atonement, to be naki. Well, the sages wanted us to go through this drama of a kind of death in order to learn lessons about life. In fact, we have very special prayers that we talk literally about who will live and who will die, to make this very dramatic. I thought about this in the context of a couple of very powerful and prominent aspects of the general culture this year, which I think make some very significant points about this. Points from a Jewish perspective and things that Judaism could definitely add to them. The first was a movie called Bucket List that starred two of the greatest actors of the time, Jack Nicholson and Morgan Freeman. Nicholson is this billionaire who buys and privatizes hospitals, and his mantra is two to a room, no exceptions, until, of course, he gets cancer and he wants his own room, but his aides say, well, that won't be very good, for publicity. So he has to share a room with Morgan Freeman, who is this brilliant, knows all the answers to Jeopardy, car mechanic, who's also dying of cancer. And one day, at first they hate each other, and then Morgan Freeman pulls out this yellow legal piece of pad of paper, and on that piece of paper, Nicholson finds it, reads it, and it's his bucket list. Nicholson finds out that it's Morgan Freeman's list that he did as an exercise in school once, where he made a list of all the things he should do before he kicks the bucket, none of which he had done. Well, Nicholson decides that they have to do them, and he's got the wherewithal, so they take his private jet, they fly around the world, and they do all these fun things. They do a motorcycle on the Great Wall of China, they climb this high mountain in Tibet, they do all these fun things. And Morgan Freeman's wife is upset about it. She wants him to be with her in his family before he dies. And finally, of course, at the end of the movie, they both die. Some of the very poignant scenes are that Morgan Freeman discovers that Nicholson has been estranged from his one daughter, and he forces Nicholson kind of to go confront his daughter and to have a rapprochement with her. And when Nicholson kisses his granddaughter for the first time, he crosses off the item on the list that said, kiss the most beautiful woman in the world. Now, the other major piece of the general culture that I think is significant was the story about this Carnegie Mellon professor who was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and decided to give a last lecture before he died, really written for his kids, but it turned into this big lecture at the school and an internet sensation where 1 million people heard the last lecture. And basically the points he made in the speech were, you should have fun, you should dream big, you should take big risks, you should always look on the best side of people, judge people charitably, you should make time for things that are important. And he told the story about how on his honeymoon, his boss insisted that he be reachable. So he left the following message. He said, I've waited 39 years to get married, I'm going for a month with my wife. My boss insists that you be able to reach me. So here's the deal. My in-laws have our phone number. Here's their number. You call them. If you can convince them that there's a valid reason to interrupt their only daughter's only honeymoon, then they'll give you our number. And we got no calls. And finally he said, be kids. Now, in reflecting on these two stories, the story of the last kick the bucket list, and the story of this speech by this professor as he lay dying, they're both very poignant and full of good ideas, but of course they're missing the most important thing in the message of Yom Kippur. And that is a verse that occurred during the summer we read in Parshat Eikev, that man does not live by bread alone. And in that same portion, we have the rhetorical question that the Torah says, what does God ask of you? What does God ask? Notice the Torah doesn't say, what do you ask of God? Most people think religion is about us asking God, but the Torah is about, what does God ask of us? And the first answer the Torah gives is that you should have yirah, you should have awe of God. And what does awe of God mean? I'll tell you a little story about this, which we call kippah or yarmulke. but it's actually spelled Yarmulke. So what is that? Well, the joke is about a guy who's walking along, going to the racetrack, going to bet some money, and he can't figure out how he's going to decide what horse to bet on. All of a sudden, a hat blows off the guy in front of him, and this fella chases down the hat and gives it back, and the man says, "God bless you." So the guy going to the racetrack said, "That must be a sign from God." He decides he's going to bet on a horse. If a horse has a name with a hat on it, he's going to bet on that horse. So in the first race, there's a horse called Stetson. He bets on it, the horse wins. Second race, there's a horse called Derby. He bets on it, the horse wins. Third race, he bets all his winnings on this horse called Chateau, thinking that's the French word for hat, and the horse loses. And he comes home, he explains to his wife what happened, and she's very upset. She says, "Well, idiot, the French word for hat is not Chateau, it's Chapeau." He goes, "Oh, darn." He says, "Well, what horse won that race?" He goes, "I don't know, some Japanese horse called Yarmulke." Well, even though we pronounce it Yarmulke, it's spelled Yarmulke for a reason, because it consists of two Aramaic words, or Hebrew-ish words, Yira de Malka. You should have awe and fear of God. What does that mean? Well, for one thing, right now, I must confess that in the mail I got a letter that I had been recorded by a camera going a few miles over the speed limit on Peterson, and I caught my license plate, and I was fined $90, even though no policeman stopped me, just this camera. And now they're installing cameras all over the place to catch speeders. And in England, because of, I guess, terrorism, they now have so many cameras downtown that the average person walking around downtown London is recorded something like 300 times a day. Well, Yira de Malka is the sense that we should have the greatest awe and respect for God, assume God is watching all the time. We talk in our prayers about God being a bochen levavot, checks what's in our heart, and we should live our life feeling like God is always before us. Shviti Adonai negdi tamid. You should feel like God is always before us, and the first thing that God says is, "You should have yira of me. You should have awe of me. More than any king, more than any president, more than anybody in your life, you should have awe of me." Second thing the Torah says is that you should walk in my way and observe my commandments. Of course, the word for walking is the root of word halacha, and Judaism has always taught that the best way to a life is a life of halacha. In fact, in Parshat Re'eh, which we read over the summer, it says, "I put before you the path of bracha and the path of klala," the way of blessing and the way of curse. You get the bracha if you follow my way. That doesn't mean you're going to have a perfect life. That doesn't mean you're going to have a life without sin, a life without trouble. But the Torah is telling us that the best kind of life, to guarantee the most meaningful kind of life, is a life of bracha. Third thing the Torah says is that you should love God. It's hard to legislate a feeling, but in the way that we say we love our spouses, we love our kids, we love our parents, we have to give the biggest chunk of that love to God. Because without God, there's nothing. There's no world. There's no us. We have nothing. We have to love God. And finally, it says to serve God, avodah. To serve God through prayer. And so for a Jew, this means take Shabbat seriously. Have Shabbat in your life. Have kashrut in your life. Love thy neighbor as thyself. Observe the Jewish holidays. To live a life of daily prayer, of praying to God. That is to serve God. There's a beautiful story told by Shlomo Carlebach about a sad story in the 73 war when a professor at Hebrew University of English Literature was wounded and alone and thought he was dying. And he tried to relieve his anxiety somewhat by dying alone on the mountain on the Golan, by reciting Shakespeare, and he said it meant nothing to him. And he recited some of the greatest literature that he knew, secular English literature, and it didn't move him at all. And finally, he'd been secular most of his life, but grew up in a religious household. Finally, before he blanked out, he came up with prayers that he didn't even know he remembered. The Shema and some of the basic Jewish prayers, crying out to God, and that calmed him very much. And instead of dying, he was blacked out, but he was found by someone and brought back, and he woke up in a hospital, and he realized that all of the secular stuff he taught, while very important, was not substantively meaningful in the spiritual way to help him in life, and that the best thing that he had transmitted to his kids was this secular literature, and that he had missed the boat hugely by forgetting that man does not live by bread alone, but by what comes out of the mouth of God. And so while this movie, The Bucket List, is a very significant idea that we should strive to do the things that we feel that would be meaningful in our life before we die, and that we should think about the kind of speech that Carnegie Mellon professor gave about how do we really want to sum up our life and what do we find most meaningful and are we doing that? That what they both are missing are the key ideas of Yom Kippur, of who will live and who will die. When we ask for more time, the key to life is to understand that we should love God and serve God and do the mitzvot and to be in awe of God and follow that path. And whatever we do in the other realms of our life, to find a life of blessing and not of curse. And pray that Yom Kippur, as we experience this mini death, be a time to reawaken to this principle, to this basic understanding of what it means to live a life of joy and prosperity, a life of meaning and fulfillment. Shalom.